Sunday of Easter on the liturgical calendar, as Keith mentioned, and it is commonly referred to as the Good Shepherd Sunday. And so our readings this morning have been about the Good Shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. There are other shepherd passages in the Bible, both good and bad. If you want the bad ones, then you would go to Ezekiel 34, and it talks about bad shepherds. But the passage that Jesus probably is referring to in John 10, he is recalling Zechariah chapter 11, which talks about two things. It talks about bad shepherds, and it talks about, or predicts or prophesies what Judas was going to do with 30 pieces of silver, if you remember. So we're going to spend our time in John chapter 10, or John chapter 9 and 10, and we're going to, what I hope for us to see from John chapter 9 and 10 are the risks and rewards of following Jesus. From John chapter 9 and 10. And that's where we'll start. John chapter 9. What happens in John chapter 9? What's most of the chapter devoted to?
Second, he healed on the Sabbath.
Pardon?
He healed on the Sabbath.
That was mistake number one. He healed on the Sabbath. But what kind of healing was it?
Blindness.
He healed a man born blind. So John chapter 9 starts off saying, as Jesus was walking along. Well, where? Where was he walking along? Was he in Jerusalem? Was he in the temple? Where was John? Where was Jesus when he was walking along?
Fairly close to the pool of Siloam.
Pretty close to the pool of Siloam, because he sent the blind man there to wash the mud off of his eyes. So probably in or near Jerusalem and the temple. So Jesus was walking along and he saw a man who'd been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his sins or his parents' sins? What were they saying?
He was suffering a punishment.
Yeah. They were saying a common idea of that day, and that is that if you've got a physical issue of some kind, it's because you're a sinner. We've got that same problem going on today, don't we?
Yes, sir.
We have people who may be sick. Well, there's got to be something wrong somewhere, or you wouldn't be sick. Got the same. It's an age-old idea. Well, he's blind, but there was a problem there somewhere that we don't know about. It was either his parents or him that sinned. It was not because of his sins or his parents' sins, Jesus answered. This happened so that the power of God could be seen in him. What was Jesus referring to at that point?
It was a miracle in waiting.
It was a miracle fixing to happen. We must quickly carry out the tasks assigned by the one who sent us. The night is coming when no one can work. But while I'm here in the world, I am the light of the world. Here we have one of 7 I am statements in the book of John. you could preach or teach a great lesson on the I am statements in the book of John. So here he says, I am the light of the world. Previously in chapter 8, he said, before Abraham was, I am. Meaning, I've always been here. I am eternal. And that's what the problem was. Well, anyway, Jesus spit on the ground, made mud from the saliva, and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. And he told him, go and wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. Could he see, or was he blind at that point? He was still blind, so he had to be pretty close to the pool of Siloam, as Christy said. His neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar asked each other, isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? Some said he was, and others said, no, it just looks like him. But the beggar gets in, wait, I'm here. It's me. I can see. I was the one healed. I'm the same one. They asked, well, who healed you? What happened? He told them, the man they called Jesus made mud and spread it over my eyes and told me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So I went and washed, and now I can see. You know, if you were remembering an Old Testament story that was similar, but not the same, but similar, what would that Old Testament story be? Who else had a physical issue and was told to go wash and be clean?
Naaman.
Yes, the leper, Naaman the leper. He was told to go wash in the muddy Jordan. And he thought, how stupid is this to go wash in a muddy river? And it insulted him. But he did, and he was cleansed. I don't get the idea that this gentleman was insulted in any form or fashion when Jesus anointed his eyes with mud made from his own spit. He put the mud over my eyes and washed off, and now I could see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man, Jesus, is not from God. Why would they say that? This man, Jesus, is not from God.
He wasn't moving it their way. He wasn't getting anything their
They
way.
weren't getting the credit.
They thought they were the last ordered on.
What were they really saying, though?
Validating himself.
They were really saying, only we can do godly things. Other people can't. Only we can. Then the Pharisees again questioned the man who'd been blind and demanded, what's your opinion about this man who healed you? Well, there's a problem. When you start asking people what their opinion is, what do you get? Opinions. That's exactly what you get. Well, the man replied, I think he must be a prophet. The Jewish leaders still refused to believe that the man had been blind and could now see. So they called his parents. Well, there you go. That's going to solve that problem. They asked him, is this your son? Yes. Was he born blind? Yes. If so, how can he now see? This is going to be interesting. His parents replied, we know he's our son. That's unquestionable. But we don't know how he can see or who healed him. Ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself. What were they doing? Deflecting, deferring. That's right. They were saying, well, don't ask me. I don't know. In other words, knowing would make me responsible. I don't know. So ask him. He's an adult. And he was. He's old enough to speak for himself. His parents said this because, why? Why did his parents say this?
Because they would have got kicked out of the synagogue.
They were afraid of being kicked out of the synagogue. And here you have one of the great risks of following Jesus. Because you might get kicked out of the synagogue. What did the synagogue mean to people in that day? Everything. It meant
Acceptance.
acceptance. If you're in, you're in. The synagogue distributed food and clothing in some cases. The synagogue distributed information. We visited synagogues, 2 or 3 of them, where there were entire educational complexes, synagogue schools in the back part of the synagogue. So there was education distributed and disseminated out of the synagogue. Food, clothing, acceptance. In most cases, if you weren't in the synagogue, where were you?
You were an outsider.
You were an outcast of society. It was your key to being in society. That's what they were afraid of. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had announced that anyone saying Jesus was the Messiah could be expelled from the synagogue. That's why they said, he's old enough, go ask him. So for the second time, they called the man in and said, who did this? Who healed you? We know this man Jesus is the sinner. We know Jesus couldn't have healed because sinners can't heal. Isn't that what they were saying? But I'm going to ask you this morning, can sinners heal?
Through Christ again.
But what made the Pharisees think so haughty-toddy that they were the only ones who could?
That's exactly what the problem. That was the disconnect in this discourse.
And that they weren't sinful.
Number one, they thought they weren't sinners, and they thought that a sinner couldn't heal. Has God ever used sinners to heal?
Absolutely.
Yes. Yes. Look at it. Anyway, yes, sinners can heal. Not because they are the healer, but because God is the healer. But because He has used sinners to heal. All right, we're running out of time. So, the net effect to the blind man when he has this discourse with the Pharisees. Let's go to verse 30. Why, that's very strange, the man replied. He healed my eyes, and yet you don't know where he comes from? We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but He is ready to hear those who worship Him and do His will. Ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. I have searched and searched and searched for a record somewhere of someone who was born blind, who was healed. I couldn't find one in Scripture. You were born a total sinner, they said. Are you trying to teach us? And what did they do? Threw him out of the synagogue. The risk of following Jesus. His parents shielded themselves from that risk, but this gentleman was thrown out of the synagogue because he followed Jesus. How did Jesus respond to that? To this man, this gentleman becoming a healed outcast. He was cast out of society. He was cast out of the synagogue. Well, wait a minute. He was already an outcast.
They've been ignoring him for years,
But he'd been ignored.
walking past him.
He was a nobody. He was a nobody. And he gets thrown out of the synagogue. How did Jesus respond to this nobody who was really a nobody now? He sought him out. He could have said, it's just collateral damage, it happens. But it says here, when Jesus heard that it has happened, He found the man. He went looking for this outcast. Where are we in this story today? Would we have gone looking for this outcast? Just ask him. Do you believe in the Son of Man? The man said, Who is he, sir? I want to believe in him. You've seen him, and he's speaking to you. Yes, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped Jesus. Jesus said, I entered into this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show that those who think they see, that they are blind. Well, that was a problem because there were some Pharisees standing around that heard him. They were convicted. You're calling us blind? They said. He pretty much said, well, if the shoe fits, wear it. Well, anyway, to go on, that's the background of John 10, which is the Good Shepherd chapter. It's this interchange or exchange with this man, with his parents, and this healing, and this gentleman who was outcast who now has believed in Jesus. And John 10 verse 1 says, I tell you the truth. And if you're reading from the NIV, they take some interpretive liberties. And they say, I tell you the truth, you Pharisees. But the word Pharisees doesn't occur in the text. But the NIV puts the word Pharisees in there. Why do they do that? It's implied. Chapter 10 is just a continuation of what happened in chapter 9, where you had Pharisees and a man born blind. And Jesus, chapter 10 just continues this. He said, I'll tell you the truth. Anyone who sneaks over the wall of a sheepfold rather than going through the gate must surely be a thief and a robber. Who's he talking to? About. Who's he talking about? I'm not going to name names. I don't want to get kicked out of the synagogue. But the one who enters through the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep recognize his voice and come to him. He calls his own sheep by name. Here's the scenario. If you've been to Turkey, if you've been to Palestine, if you've been even in countries in Africa, South Africa maybe, I don't know how, but I do know that at the end of the day, there will be flocks of sheep and goats from all over the region come to a central compound for safekeeping for the night. And it's in most cases, and especially in Israel, going to be a rock compound. There's only one way in. And they run these sheep in there, and then a gatekeeper sits in the gate. And nobody goes in or out. But there's all kinds of different flocks in there. And when the shepherd goes into that compound and calls, which sheep come to him? Only his. He can go in there and go to that gate and call, and only his sheep will come out. And that's true to this day. And that's what he's talking about here. Verse 6, those who heard Jesus use this illustration didn't understand what he meant, so he explained it to them. I'll tell you the truth. I am the gate for the sheep. Another one of his I am statements. He said in verse 11, I am the good shepherd. The third, that's another one of his I am statements. So he says, I am the gate and I am the shepherd. Real quickly, who was the intended audience for the Gospel of John? Wasn't necessarily the Jews. John is widely accepted as known as the pastor to Asia Minor. He mainly ministered in Asia Minor, Turkey, and in that area. In fact, he was exiled at the end of his life on the Isle of Patmos. But he's widely accepted to be called the pastor to Asia Minor or to Turkey. Because, and so his gospel is presented not just to Jews, but also to Greeks, Hellenists, people with that particular worldview. And so they had an idea that any time you had a transition in your life, you were moving to another chapter in your life, just exactly what we have going on right now in our culture, all over the country. Next week, we're going to have graduations. Kids are going to be graduating from high school. They're already graduating from college. Some are getting married. These are transition moments. They're going on to another chapter in their life. The Greeks had a god they prayed to anytime there was a graduation or a marriage or a transition in life. They prayed to their god Janus, Janus, Janus. So they would pray, and this was you've seen his pictures. He had two faces, one facing forward and one facing backward. He looked to the future and he honored the past. But they prayed to him to help them in this transition, this graduation in life. The word that is translated gate in John 10, when I am the gate for the sheep, that's the word that is translated the goddess or god Janus in Greek. And so Jesus was brilliantly communicating both to the Greek Hellenist listeners and to the Jews. The Jewish people would have understood his shepherding metaphors. The Greek Hellenists would have understood the gate metaphors. He was brilliantly communicating to both. Anyway, he says, I'm both the gate and the shepherd. You cannot transition into the next life, into the better life, unless you go through me. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and life. We're going to wrap it up. He says three things in John chapter 10, verse 27. My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me. Three descriptive terms that describe I know my sheep. They hear me, and they follow me. So my question is, where are you in this illustration? Are you hearing Jesus? Are you seeing Jesus and the way he interacts with people who've been cast out and marginalized? Are you hearing him? But most importantly, are you following Jesus? There's risks and rewards to following the Good Shepherd. What's the risk of following the Good Shepherd?
Being judged.
It's going to be judged.
You'll be judged inside the church just as much as you are.
Now wait a minute, Brother Mac. You're kind of sugarcoating it there. Speak metaphorically. There are risks and rewards. The risks are, yes, we are going to be judged. We may, if we follow Jesus, we may end up like the blind man. We may be cast out. But where is Jesus through it all in this process? Right there.